"This auction is for serious buyers only, ma'am." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Eleanor Palmer's weathered hands trembled as she clutched her small handbag, knuckles white against the worn leather. The auction house, with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, suddenly felt even more cavernous, every eye in the room boring into her faded floral dress and scuffed shoes. What the crowd didn't notice was the tall figure in the back row, sunglasses just removed, watching not the auctioneer, but the slight tremor in Eleanor's shoulders as she stood her ground. The Ashford estate wasn't just another luxury property changing hands among the elite. For 78 years, it had been Eleanor's home, where she'd taken her first steps, married her husband, raised her children, and buried her memories. Financial hardship had forced its sale 3 months ago, but a small inheritance had given her one desperate chance to reclaim it. The auction room buzzed with Manhattan's wealthiest property collectors, their tailored suits and designer dresses forming a sea of privilege around Eleanor's simple attire. The auctioneer's smile never reached his eyes. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable observing from the back," the auctioneer continued, his voice dripping with practiced politeness that did nothing to mask the dismissal. Titters rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly, dignity her only shield. In the pause that followed, a chair scraped against marble. A path cleared through the crowd as a man in a simple black suit approached the front. The whispering began instantly, recognition spreading like wildfire. Keanu Reeves was walking toward Eleanor, and the auctioneer's smug smile was beginning to falter. The auction house fell into a strange hush as Keanu Reeves moved toward the front of the room. His presence wasn't announced by fanfare or special treatment, just the quiet recognition that rippled through the crowd like an electric current. He wore a simple black suit that spoke of quality rather than ostentation, his beard slightly unkempt, hair just touching his shoulders. There was nothing of Hollywood in his demeanor, just a deliberate calm as he approached Eleanor. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Eleanor blinked in confusion, momentarily not recognizing him. "No, it's free," she answered automatically. Keanu sat down next to her with unhurried grace, placing his auction paddle on his lap. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly thrown off his rhythm. The power dynamic of the room had shifted in an instant. The whispers around them crescendoed, phone cameras discreetly raised, social media coming alive with the unexpected celebrity sighting. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could maintain decorum," the auctioneer said, his voice carrying a nervous edge now. "We're about to begin with Lot 42, the historic Ashford estate. Bidding starts at $4.5 million. Eleanor's shoulders sank just slightly. The figure might as well have been all the stars in the sky, equally unattainable. She clutched her small handbag tighter, inside which rested the bank draft for her life savings and her small inheritance. Not even close to enough. The first bid came from a silver-haired gentleman in the front row, $4.6 million, with a casual lift of his paddle that spoke of wealth so ingrained that millions were mere trifles. Eleanor watched the number climb as if viewing an ascending rocket, 4.8, 5.2, 5.5 million, each increment pushing her dream further into impossibility. "Are you here for the house?" Keanu asked softly, his voice meant only for her. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still fixed on the auctioneer. "It was my home. I was born in the upstairs bedroom in 1945. She paused, uncertain why she was sharing this with a stranger, celebrity or not. "My grandchildren were born there too. I know it's silly to try, but I had to." The woman in designer silk 2 rows ahead turned around, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Oh my God, it's really him," she stage-whispered to her companion, not even attempting discretion. "What's he doing with that old lady?" Keanu didn't acknowledge the comment, his focus entirely on Eleanor. "Why did you have to sell it?" he asked. "Medical bills," Eleanor replied, her voice matter-of-fact, rather than seeking pity. My husband, cancer, insurance only covered so much. A lifetime of love and loss distilled into 4 short sentences. $6.2 million, going once, the auctioneer called, building tension with practiced expertise. Excuse me. Eleanor's voice was so quiet that at first no one reacted. She raised her hand, the slight tremor more pronounced now. Excuse me, I'd like to speak. The auctioneer's annoyance was poorly concealed. Madam, this is not a forum for discussion. If you wish to bid, please use your paddle. I know I can't afford what they're offering, Eleanor continued, rising to her feet slowly. Her voice gained strength with each word. But that house holds my family's history. My husband built the gazebo by hand for our 30th anniversary. My children's height marks are still penciled on the kitchen door frame. There's a dent in the parlor floor where my son dropped his chemistry set in '72. A few uncomfortable chuckles circulated. The auctioneer's smile thinned to a line. Madam, while your sentiments are touching, this is a business transaction. The property's historical quirks are, frankly, irrelevant to its market value. The silver-haired bidder checked his watch impatiently. Someone near the back called out, Can we move this along? Eleanor remained standing, dignity wrapped around her like armor. I understand. I just thought, her voice faltered slightly, that whoever buys it might want to know they're getting more than just walls and a roof. You're buying a home that was loved. The auctioneer sighed audibly into his microphone. Yes, well, noted. Now $6.2 million going twice. Sold for $6.2 million to bidder number 27. The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to echo in Eleanor's chest. She slowly sank back into her seat, hands folded tightly in her lap, her composure a fragile shell that threatened to crack at any moment. The silver-haired man in the front row was already reaching for his phone, probably to instruct some assistant to handle the details. For him, it was an acquisition. For Eleanor, it was watching her life's foundation being carted away. I'm sorry, she whispered, though to whom, herself, her absent family, the house itself, wasn't clear. Don't be sorry yet, Keanu said quietly. He hadn't moved, hadn't picked up his paddle once during the bidding. His stillness had its own gravity. The auctioneer was already moving on, his voice regaining its practiced rhythm. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move to Lot 43, a Fifth Avenue penthouse formerly owned by... Excuse me? Keanu's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The room turned toward him as one, the collective whispering rising again like a swarm of insects. I have a question about the previous lot. The auctioneer faltered, clearly caught between protocol and the reality of addressing a Hollywood star. Sir, the Ashford estate has been sold. If you were interested in bidding, I'm afraid the opportunity has passed. I'm not interested in bidding, Keanu replied, standing now. He was not a towering man, but something in his posture commanded attention. I'm interested in understanding why we're treating this like a simple property transaction when it's clearly much more than that. The silver-haired buyer turned in his seat, irritation evident in the set of his shoulders. Because that's exactly what it is, he said coolly. A property transaction. Eleanor looked up at Keanu, confusion written across her features. This wasn't how these things worked. Rich people didn't intervene for strangers. Celebrities didn't get involved in ordinary heartbreaks. Yet, here he was, standing beside her, his presence creating a strange island of calm in the charged atmosphere of the auction house. Perhaps to you, Keanu responded to the buyer, his voice level but firm. But I think we all just heard that it's something else entirely to Mrs. He paused, turning to Eleanor. Palmer, she supplied softly. Eleanor Palmer. To Mrs. Palmer, Keanu continued, this isn't just property. This is her history, her family's legacy. His gaze swept the room, making brief but purposeful eye contact with various attendees. How many of us can say we truly value the places we call home? How many of us have memories built into the very walls of where we live? A woman near the back called out, "That's very poetic, Mr. Reeves, but business is business. If she couldn't afford to keep her house, that's unfortunate, but not our problem." The comment sparked murmurs of agreement from some quarters of the room, but also uncomfortable shifting from others. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly eager to regain control of the proceedings. "While this is all very moving," he said with thinly veiled sarcasm, "we do have a schedule to maintain. The sale has been completed according to the rules of this auction house." Keanu nodded slowly. "I understand rules. I respect them." His voice took on a different quality now, the calm deliberation many recognized from his more philosophical interviews. But sometimes rules exist to serve systems, not people. Sometimes they protect transactions but destroy value. The silver-haired buyer stood now, turning fully to face Keanu. He was shorter but carried himself with the absolute confidence of the extremely wealthy. "This is absurd. I purchased that property fairly. Whatever sentimental value it holds for this woman is frankly irrelevant." Eleanor flinched slightly at being referred to as "this woman," but her eyes never left Keanu, watching with a mixture of confusion and growing hope. "Is it irrelevant?" Keanu asked, directing his question not just to the buyer, but to the entire room. "What if the value of that house isn't just in its square footage or its address? What if its true worth is in the life that was lived there?" Phones were out now, recording openly. The auction house staff looked to the manager in the corner, who was rapidly whispering into his own phone, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "This is a waste of time," the buyer snapped. "I won the bid. The house is mine." "You won the bid, yes," Keanu acknowledged, his tone still measured. "But I wonder what exactly you think you've purchased." He turned to Eleanor again. "Mrs. Palmer, you mentioned your husband built a gazebo. When was that?" A hush had fallen over the room now, the audience captivated despite themselves. Eleanor straightened slightly in her seat, her voice finding new strength as she spoke about what she loved. 1986, our 30th anniversary. Walter spent 6 months on it, working evenings and weekends. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He taught mathematics at the high school. But he learned for me because I'd always wanted one. "And your children's height marks on the doorframe?" A small, genuine smile touched Eleanor's lips. "We started with James in 1957. The last mark is for my youngest granddaughter, Lily, from just before Christmas." The silver-haired buyer checked his watch pointedly. "This is all very touching, but—" "Sir," Keanu interrupted, turning to the buyer directly, "you've just spent $6.2 million on a house. Surely you can spare 3 minutes to learn what you've actually bought?" There was no aggression in his voice, just a gentle challenge that made looking away difficult. Murmurs of agreement now rippled through the crowd, the tide of the room shifting. Some of the earlier mockers were looking distinctly uncomfortable. The man who had called for things to move along earlier was now conspicuously silent. The auctioneer, sensing the change in atmosphere, attempted to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we could arrange for Mrs. Palmer to provide some historical notes about the property to the new owner? A kind of provenance document?" "Provenance," Keanu repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting word. It means the place of origin, the beginning of something's existence. Mrs. Palmer is the living provenance of that house. Her life is woven into its existence." He paused, looking directly at the silver-haired buyer. "When you renovate it, will you keep the height marks on the doorframe? Or will you strip them away because they don't match your vision?" The question hung in the air, simple but devastating in its clarity. The silver-haired buyer's face flushed slightly, the first crack in his polished veneer. "What I do with my property is my business," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The word "my" hung awkwardly in the air, suddenly sounding less like ownership and more like appropriation. A woman in the third row spoke up unexpectedly. My grandmother's house was sold when she had to go into care. The new owners bulldozed it within a week. I drive past that lot sometimes. Her voice carried an echo of Eleanor's loss. I wish I'd fought harder to keep it. Keanu nodded his acknowledgement to her, then turned back to the buyer. No one is questioning your legal right to the house. The question is about something deeper, about recognizing that some purchases come with responsibilities that can't be listed in a deed. The buyer's jaw tightened. I don't need a lecture on morality from a Hollywood actor. Not a lecture, Keanu corrected gently. A conversation, one we should probably have had before the bidding started. Eleanor, who had been watching this exchange with increasing disbelief, finally spoke. Please, I don't want to cause trouble. I knew when I came here today that the chances were... Her voice faltered. I just wanted whoever bought it to know what they were getting. And now I do, the buyer said curtly. Are we finished with this interruption? The auction manager approached the podium, whispering urgently to the auctioneer, who nodded repeatedly. The manager then turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of this unusual circumstance, we're going to take a brief 15-minute intermission. Please enjoy refreshments in the adjoining room. Bidding will resume afterward. As people began to rise from their seats, murmuring among themselves, Keanu leaned closer to Eleanor. Mrs. Palmer, may I ask how much you were able to bring today? Eleanor hesitated, then opened her handbag and withdrew a bank draft. $112,000, she said quietly. It's everything I have. I knew it wouldn't be enough, but I had to try. Keanu looked at the check, then at Eleanor's face, the determined set of her mouth, the pride in her eyes despite her defeat. Excuse me, Mr. Reeves? The auction manager approached their seats, professional smile firmly in place. Could I have a word with you privately? Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Mrs. Palmer, Keanu replied evenly. The manager's smile tightened. Very well. While we appreciate your concern for this situation, the auction house has protocols. The sale has been completed according to our rules. Rules are important, Keanu agreed. So is compassion. The silver-haired buyer hadn't left for refreshments. Instead, he approached their small group, his expression carefully neutral now. Mr. Reeves, I assume you have a proposal in mind? Let's hear it. A small crowd had gathered around them, abandoning any pretense of not listening. Smartphone cameras recorded discreetly and not so discreetly. The buyer was clearly aware of the optics of the situation. Arguing with a beloved celebrity over an elderly woman's home was not going to play well on social media. Actually, I do, Keanu said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his own checkbook. Mrs. Palmer has $112,000. I'm prepared to add $6.1 million to that amount. He began writing deliberately. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Reeves, no, she protested. I couldn't possibly accept. You're not accepting anything, Mrs. Palmer, Keanu said, his pen still moving across the check. We're making a joint purchase. You'll contribute what you can, and I'll contribute what I can. You want to buy the house? The buyer asked incredulously. You could have bid during the auction. Keanu finished writing and looked up. I don't want to buy the house. I want Mrs. Palmer to have her home back. There's a difference. He handed the check to the auction manager. This, plus Mrs. Palmer's contribution, matches the winning bid exactly. The manager examined the check, his eyebrows rising slightly. This is highly irregular. The auction is concluded. Then consider it a private sale, Keanu suggested. You have the buyer's money either way. The only question is who gets the house. The buyer was silent for a long moment, aware that every eye in the room was fixed on him. Whatever decision he made would be broadcast across social media within minutes. Finally, he spoke with careful precision. The house doesn't matter that much to me. It was an investment opportunity. He turned to Eleanor. I had no idea of its personal significance. Eleanor stood straighter now, finding strength she didn't know she had. It's not just my home, she said. It's where my family became who we are, where we celebrated birthdays and mourned losses, where my husband took his last breath, holding my hand, in the room where we'd spent 58 years sleeping side by side. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the staff had stopped pretending to busy themselves with preparations for the next auction lot. I understand, the buyer said, and for the first time, it seemed he actually might. He turned to the auction manager. I'm willing to cede my claim if Mr. Reeves and Mrs. Palmer can provide the equivalent funds. The manager hesitated, clearly calculating the PR implications of every possible decision. We would need to confirm the funds and have our legal department review. Let me simplify this, Keanu interjected. The funds are valid. I'll cover any additional fees or complications. He turned to the buyer. Thank you for reconsidering. The buyer nodded curtly, then addressed Eleanor directly. I hope you enjoy many more years in your home, Mrs. Palmer. Eleanor's composure finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes as the reality of what was happening sank in. I will, she managed to say. Thank you. Spontaneous applause broke out among the onlookers. Someone called out, Keanu for president, drawing scattered laughter and more applause. Phones recorded everything, the story already spreading beyond the walls of the auction house. Amid the growing commotion, Keanu placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Let's get you home, Mrs. Palmer, he said quietly. The words meant for her, alone. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why would you do this for a stranger? Keanu smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. Because someday, I hope someone would do it for me. The paperwork took less than an hour. The auction house, sensing the public relations goldmine unfolding within their walls, expedited everything with unprecedented efficiency. Eleanor sat in a leather chair in a private office, watching in disbelief as signatures and stamps transformed hope back into reality. Keanu remained beside her through it all, deflecting questions from the auction house staff about his motivations with gentle but firm redirections. Outside, a crowd had gathered. News travels fast when it involves one of Hollywood's most beloved actors performing an act of extraordinary kindness. By the time they emerged from the office, several news crews had stationed themselves at the entrance. Mr. Reeves, can you tell us why you stepped in today? Mrs. Palmer, how does it feel to keep your home? Keanu, was this planned or spontaneous? The questions came rapid fire, microphones thrust forward. Eleanor blinked in the sudden flash of cameras, momentarily overwhelmed. Without hesitation, Keanu placed himself slightly in front of her, a human shield against the media barrage. Today isn't about me, he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without shouting. It's about recognizing that homes aren't just buildings. They're the keepers of our stories. His hand rested lightly on Eleanor's shoulder, steadying her. Mrs. Palmer has more stories to write in hers. By evening, the video had gone viral. Keanu Saves Home trended across platforms, alongside Remembering What Matters and Ashford Estate. News outlets picked up the story, each adding their own angle. Keanu Reeves, action hero in real life. Hollywood star stands up to auction house elitism, the house that love saved. What few of these stories captured was what happened after the camera stopped rolling, how Keanu insisted on driving Eleanor home himself, how he declined her tearful invitation to come inside, saying simply, "This is your moment with your home. Enjoy your reunion," how he promised to check in on her in a few weeks, a promise everyone who knew him understood he would keep. Inside the Ashford estate, Eleanor walked slowly from room to room, trailing her fingers along familiar walls. In the kitchen, she stood before the doorframe with its pencil marks. James, 1957. Sarah, 1960. Thomas, 1962. Each child, each grandchild, their growth marked in inches and years. In the parlor, she found the dent in the hardwood where Thomas's chemistry set had spilled. In the master bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed where Walter had taken his last breath. "I'm home," she whispered, to the empty room that wasn't empty at all. "We kept it." 3 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Keanu's home. Inside was a check for $112,000 and a note that read, "I cannot accept such generosity without offering what I have. The house is yours as much as mine now." Keanu wrote back the same day, "The house is yours, Mrs. Palmer. Always has been. Always will be. The only thing I ask is that you keep making memories there. That's worth more than money could ever buy." The story continued to spread, evolving beyond celebrity gossip into something more meaningful. Discussion panels on news programs debated the meaning of home in modern society. Social media filled with people sharing stories of houses that had shaped their lives, places they'd lost, memories embedded in wood and stone and glass. A month later, a small foundation was established, funded initially by an anonymous donor, though few had doubts about the source. Its mission, to help elderly homeowners remain in their residences when faced with financial hardship. Its name, the Ashford Initiative. In a world increasingly defined by transience, where houses are investments and homes are temporary, the story of Eleanor Palmer and her house became something of a parable, a reminder that the true value of a place isn't calculated in dollars, but in the depth of the marks it leaves on our lives.